Hello, welcome back to our series on the book of Nehemiah. Over the last few weeks, we've been introduced to this guy called Nehemiah, haven't we? And we've heard some of this incredible story of how Nehemiah, even though he was just an ordinary bloke doing an ordinary job, has been called into an extraordinary mission to go and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down, and to go and to save God's people from trouble and from a terrible situation. And we've heard how he was able to do that because God had put him in just the right place at just the right time. And so today we're going to pick up that story as we turn to chapter 4 of Nehemiah. But before we do that, I want to tell you a little story. A story about a guy called Igor Sikorsky. And he was a Russian inventor, and he was fascinated when he was a young boy with the idea of flying. And his parents kept trying to discourage him. They kept reminding him that human flight was impossible, but no one had ever done it before. But amazingly, that didn't put him off. And he kept trying and trying. And eventually he figured out how to build a helicopter. He was one of the first ever people to invent a helicopter. And later on in life, he had his own factory building helicopters. And on the wall of his factory, he printed a poster. And on it, he wrote these words. He said, "According to science, the bumblebee cannot fly because the shape and weight of his body in relation to his total wing area is wrong. The bumblebee, however, does not know this, so he goes ahead and flies anyway." And I love that. I just love how he faced this opposition to his dream, even from his own parents. And yet he had the faith that allowed him to overcome that. And he was able to make his dream a reality. And we'll see as we turn to Nehemiah chapter 4, but actually Nehemiah faced some pretty big opposition. He had this calling from God to go and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But it wasn't all plain sailing. He faced some pretty big challenges along the way. And we'll see that as we turn to chapter 4. But we'll also see how God gave him the strength to overcome those obstacles. So turn with me, if you will, to Nehemiah chapter 4. And this is what God says. And when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stone. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from their sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them, and we will kill them and put an end to the work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families, with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fights for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work, with half the men holding spears, from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, let every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so that they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water. So as I said, Nehemiah, even as he's called by God to this extraordinary task, he isn't without opposition, is he? He isn't without his struggles and his difficulties. And I think we see that in two forms, don't we? Two different ways that Nehemiah is opposed. And it comes firstly in the form of insults, and then secondly in the form of threats. So firstly, verses 1 to 6, we see these insults that Nehemiah has to deal with. You notice we read this. It says, but when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stone. So this kind of opposition that Nehemiah faces, it's probably one that we've all encountered at one time or another, isn't it? It's this kind of schoolyard bullying, just hurling insults from his enemies. These guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, they come along and they just start mocking him. Pardon me. They just start saying, you think you're good enough? You think you're doing a good job? All of your best efforts have added up to nothing. You're rubbish. You're pathetic. Even my nan could do a better job. Even a fox could come along and knock down your wall. You're rubbish. So basically, they're just mocking him. They're just taunting him. And as I say, it seems like playground stuff, doesn't it? But actually, that kind of mocking, that kind of insult, can actually be quite effective, can't it? It can be quite hurtful, especially if it's aimed at something really personal to us. Nehemiah has left everything to go and rebuild the wall. And he's worked really hard on this. And so this kind of insult, this kind of mocking can really affect us, can't it? So what does Nehemiah do? How does he respond? Well, notice that he prays, doesn't he? His initial response is to take it to the Lord. But I'll warn you that his prayer is a pretty strange one. It's a pretty weird one. He says this. He says, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So what is going on here? Chances are, if you've attended church at all in your life, you've probably heard someone say that we are to forgive our enemies. That we are to love our neighbours as ourselves. Maybe you've heard the Lord's Prayer being recited. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And yet Nehemiah here, he's faced with these insults and he prays, "Lord, don't forgive them. Lord, heap their sins upon them." It's pretty weird, isn't it? Think, hold on a minute, that's not right. That's not a Christian thing to pray, surely. Surely we're supposed to pray that they would be forgiven, right? But notice that even though Nehemiah's prayer perhaps isn't quite right, it's not quite living up to Christ's standards, is it? But he's still doing, I think, something pretty radical. He's still doing something quite amazing. Because what he's doing is he's actually asking that God would punish his enemies. He's taking that desire for justice and he's putting it in God's hands instead of taking it into his own hand, isn't he? So he's not quite getting it completely right. He's not quite being Jesus here. But he's still doing something quite good. How different is this to how we often act? So often when we are wronged, when we're insulted, or when we face difficulty, so often our initial reaction is to want to take it into our own hands, isn't it? It's to want to get justice for ourselves. Is to want to sort of get our own back. But Nehemiah doesn't do that. He's insulted, he's wronged, and he says, "Lord, you deal with it. Lord, I put this into your hands. Lord, you get justice for this." And I think that's a really interesting response. For example, the other day, I popped into the retail estate just to pick something up, and I had Eli in the car. So I went to park in, one of those parent and toddler parking spaces. And I was just about to drive in and I was indicating and everything. And just as I was about to park, someone nipped into the parking space in front of me. So I was a bit frustrated. And then just as I was about to drive off, I noticed that this person didn't even have a child in their car. And I was so annoyed. I was so angry. I was ready to, jump out of the car and give them hell. I was ready to make them pay. Yeah, but here we see a different, better way to respond, don't we? We can take that desire for justice, that desire to make things right, and instead of taking it upon ourselves, we can leave it to the Lord. And I mean, that's just a silly example. But we can take that principle and we can apply it even to big things, even to big insults, even to sort of times when we've been seriously hurt. We can remember that actually he is the perfect judge. And so we can trust him to sort it out. We can trust him to make sure that everything is done justly and rightly. And I think actually if we can learn to do that, then it's so freeing, isn't it? We don't have to carry around the weight of that burden of it being upon us to put things right. It's not up to us to make sure that people get what is coming to them, to make sure that people get what they deserve. We can simply take that burden and hand it over to the Lord. And that's what Nehemiah does, isn't it? He takes this weight and he gives it to God and he says, Lord, I am insulted, I am offended, I am upset. I want to put it right. But Lord, I leave it in your hands. And how freeing must that have been? And so Nehemiah, he faces these insults, he faces these offences, and he hands them over to God. He frees himself of that burden. But the second type of opposition that he faces then is perhaps one that is even more difficult. Not just insults, not just mocking, but he faces also direct threats, doesn't he? Notice verses 11 to 12, and we're told this. There's also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them, and will kill them, and put an end to the work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. Now, perhaps for most of us living here in the UK, this isn't a kind of opposition that we've had to face all that often. It's not ever so likely that we've had death threats for being Christians. But it's becoming perhaps more and more likely, isn't it? Being a Christian in the West is becoming more difficult. It's not unlikely these days, or it's not impossible for Christians to face that kind of persecution, even here in the UK. Christians might lose their job. They might, be faced with financial punishments or even jail time for believing the things that the Bible teaches. So this kind of threat, isn't impossible. It's something that we have to be prepared for. And so how does Nehemiah deal with this? When he's faced with these real threats against his life and against the life of his people, how does he respond? Well, notice firstly that he takes it seriously, doesn't he? Verse 13, he says, therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords and spears and bows. But clearly, Nehemiah is taking this threat to be genuine. He's thinking that this is a credible threat. Sanballat and Tobiah, they're not just making this up. This isn't just an empty threat. This is real. And so he puts in place some sort of common sense precaution, doesn't he? He does what he can to limit the threat. He does what he can to protect his people. But then in verse 14, and I love this, verse 14, he says this. He says, but don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. You see, Nehemiah isn't foolish, is he? He's not being careless. But he's also not afraid either, is he? He realizes that no matter what happens, no matter how credible this threat is, that there is a greater protection. That there is something greater than their swords and their bows and their spears. That they have the protection of the Lord. And ultimately, that's something that we need to remember as well, isn't it? And yes, we face opposition. Yes, we face threats. And yes, in the coming years, that threat might increase. As Christians, we might come under increasing pressure in our culture. And we face all sorts of other threats as well, don't we? Threats from viruses, threats from all sorts of places. But ultimately, we can remember that no matter how big the threat, no matter how scary it might feel, ultimately we have no real reason to be afraid. Because the Lord is with us. He is bigger than any danger we might face. As Jesus himself said, he said, don't worry. Don't be afraid of those who can harm your body, because they can't harm your soul. That is the hope that we have, isn't it? But no matter what happens, our soul is secure in Christ. But no threat can ever take that away. It makes me think of the words of In Christ Alone, a hymn that we sing quite often. And in the final verse, it says this. It says, from life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hands. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I stand. And we can confidently say that, can't we? No matter what happens in this life or in the next, Christ is the one who commands our destiny, isn't he? And we don't have anything to fear. And so like Nehemiah, when we are faced with threats, we don't have to fear, because we know that he is with us. We can stand firm, we can stand secure, because the Lord, who is great and awesome, has secured our destiny.